I get that too. Great.
So welcome again with the Train the Trainer podcast. Conversation with Preston Cline. As always, the goal is to bridge the gap between scientists, and practice, and have good conversations. And this time about a great concept, I think, for my colleagues in the Netherlands and in Europe in general, about mission critical teams. I think I have a clue what it means, but um, let's just go in that, Preston. But maybe you could talk a little bit about who you are, what you're doing, and
Sure.
for a short introduction.
Sure. My name is Preston Cline, Dr. Preston Cline. I started my career as a wilderness guide. So I was leading expeditions around the United States with a lot of different kind of populations, including kids that were out of prison. And we were doing long expeditions, 60 days in the field, 2 months, coming in for a couple of weeks and going back out. And as a wilderness guide, you're also an educator. You're training all the time. And so I became really fascinated with this question about how people learn to navigate uncertainty. And so how do we, if we were going to help kids who are struggling, some of their choices are creating really difficult lives for them. And great, it's not just them, obviously. There's context as well, history as well, race and gender and all these other things. But at the end of the day, as Viktor Frankl would say, between stimulus and response, there's a choice, right? And so this question of, well, how can we give them the opportunity to make better choices within themselves? And this has led me on a 30-year academic journey. I went to Rutgers, which is a university in New Jersey here in the United States, and then Harvard, a little provincial college in Boston, and then University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia, where I got my doctorate. And what I studied, because when you study teams, there are different researchers around the world that categorize. There's 100 different classification of kinds of teams, and I wanted to be really specific in my research. And so I went and looked at the teams I was interested in: fire, trauma medicine, special operations, tactical law enforcement, later mission command at NASA, and others. And what I found was they had a lot in common. And the things they had in common were they were indigenously trained, meaning that you don't go to college to be a firefighter or special operations, you go to them. Even trauma surgery or paramedics, you can go to school, but you don't learn the job until you learn it at the sort of the knees of the experts and the elders. And so it was, indigenously trained. All of them are training for environments, decision-making environments of about 300 seconds or less. And the reason that's true is because that's about how much oxygen you have stored in your brain right now. So if there's a problem, a real problem, pardon me, and we need to solve it, we've got about 300 seconds or it becomes a different problem. And so if you look at special operations, if you look at fire, if you look at tactical law enforcement, if you look at trauma resuscitation, all of them are training for this kind of a window. And all of them also are working on teams, about 4 to 12 people. And we can talk later about the disconnect in medicine right now between how some providers see themselves historically and how they're actually working, and they're not the same. So there are many surgeons that I've talked to who see themselves as individuals, but if you ask them when the last time they saw a patient by themselves,
Yeah.
they have to think, because it's never. The answer is never, but they have to be like, well, you don't understand, President. I'm like, I do. I just don't think you're connecting to the fact that the world's changed.
Yeah.
And then the last sort of variable here is that the consequence of failure is catastrophic, or can be. And so this is different than, say, an accountant or I don't know, another profession, a mechanic, where, well, that's not there are a lot of other sort of everyday jobs that don't require you to make life or death decisions or be worried about your own security.
Yeah.
In the world I'm in, every day you have to do that. And that requires a different way to communicate, a different way to understand time, a different understanding of teams, all these things. And so that's what I study, and that's what I continue to study. We work specifically in what are called the Five Eye countries, which is the UK, US, Canada, New Zealand, and Australia. We've gotten permission. We operate under a treaty. We've gotten permission from some of our primary stakeholders to work with other countries, but that's primarily who we work with.
Okay, great. So if to summarize, and if my memory is good, it's about high stake environments, it's about high pressure, it's about high consequences, and yeah, well, the three elements. These before I want to ask you the real questions. Are, for example, SWAT teams, are it mission critical teams?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep. And when we say critical, we're very specific. We mean urgency, as you just mentioned.
Mhm.
We mean consequence, meaning bad consequence. We mean complexity, meaning the problem set is not so easy to solve. And we need immersive, meaning you don't get to call a timeout. So if
Yeah.
you're in combat, you don't get to say to the enemy, I need a minute to get coffee. Or if you're
Yeah.
in surgery and somebody's bleeding out, you're not like, I need to go to the bathroom. It's immersive. You're in it.
And to clarify it even more, is a sport team playing at the highest level?
No.
No, not a mission critical team.
It's not, and this is where it gets super complicated because there are teams that will think of themselves that way, and they do hard things that have high consequence, jobs, careers, and everything else. And there are a lot we can learn from them. So if you think about, we work with the New Zealand All Blacks, we work with a bunch of professional sports teams here in the United States, occasionally in the UK. And in those teams, what if you look at football, your football, or basketball, or rugby, or cricket, what they're able to do because they're a constrained environment, no one's changing the size of the pitch, right? No one's having people from the outside invade. The game is very constrained, meaning that they can spend a lot of time and energy looking at very specific aspects of human development and performance. And we
Yeah.
obviously benefit from that. So,
Yeah.
what we try to do is be really good citizens and include them where we can so that we can have a steady exchange of knowledge as they're finding stuff as we're finding stuff. But people often say, sports is like war. No, it's not. And then people say war is like sports. No, it's not. Right?
Mm.
That's ridiculous. And so it's not at all like that. And so we have to be careful of that. We can certainly learn from each other, but they're not the same thing.
Yeah, this is maybe I think important because here in Holland, the sports psychology and sport analogies were introduced into, for example, when I worked with sport teams,
Yeah,
we sometimes talked about, like be a sportsman and that kind of stuff, but it didn't it didn't fit totally. It didn't fit. It of course you can learn, but it's not the same.
yeah,
Even many of my colleagues also had the idea they didn't feel like being an athlete. They were
yeah,
cops and they were doing
yeah.
they were doing cop things. Okay. Well, okay. Then mission critical teams. What is the mission critical team institute, and why is it important for my Dutch colleagues to follow you? What is the relevancy?
What's the relevancy? Yep. So we were started very simple. Our mission is very simple, actually. It's in most, as I mentioned, most of these folks are indigenously trained, meaning that one day on a Friday, they're an operator, what we call an operator, the person who's doing the thing. And then on Monday, they're now an instructor. They're like, okay, you're done here, you're going here. And there's several huge gulfs that have to be crossed. One is just because you can do a thing doesn't mean you can teach a thing. Secondly, if you see yourself, your identity as an operator, and suddenly they take that away from you and say, now you're an instructor, well, now it's very disorienting. It affects your competence, your confidence. It does all these things. And then, secondly, and most importantly, which we work on, is what's called the tacit knowledge transfer problem, which is just because you know what right looks and feels like doesn't mean that you can articulate or describe it. And so we spend most of our time working with mission critical teams and their instructor cadres, trying to understand the nuances of their craft and helping them, not us, but them, articulate, find a language, a shared language they can describe it. So why does this matter?
Yeah.
So I don't know in the Netherlands, but in the US, our medical students graduate in May and they start residency in July. And everyone says don't go to the hospital in July because they're all beginners. And what I would argue is the difference in July, in part, between a successful interaction with a patient and an unsuccessful interaction is the ability for the attending physician to articulate to that new resident what right looks and feels like in that moment.
Yeah.
And I would argue the better you are at that, the more likely you're going to have a positive patient outcome in those few months and for the next few years of that residency.
It's great because there is research from Germany, Mario Staller.
Okay.
He does a lot of police research, especially on trainers and coaches, where this problem is happening because most of the police trainers, they were just cops and they were good at shooting, for
That's
example, and
right.
now they're teachers.
Yep. Yep.
But also, there was a beautiful paper about situational awareness, and
Yep.
it was from Huta from Finland, a police inspector, where he said, yeah, the expert officers all know what we're talking about, but they have no vocabulary. So
That's right.
we cannot teach it. So yeah, that's a problem. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's where we spend a lot of our time.
Yeah.
And we have a process called green paper, gray paper, white paper. And really simply what that is as we teach and move amongst the teams, observing or teaching them, we're constantly encountering new phenomenon. So the latest one we're working on is this concept of apprenticeship. Now, as you know, as everyone knows, apprenticeship goes back to the medieval guilds. But the medieval guilds, you were with your master for 7 years. There is nobody in a modern trade that sits on someone's knee for 7 years and lives in their house, right? That's not at all what's happening. And so people keep referencing apprenticeship, but they've lost many of the key parts of it, which includes the socialization, the resiliency, the robustness, the mindfulness, all the stuff that comes with living and working with somebody for a long period of time with them under their wing. They're protecting you from top, they're protecting you.
Yeah.
Nowadays, you're likely, if you get a few weeks with somebody, and that's not enough time to learn the other stuff. So what we are sort of looking at is the fact that in the US, there's roughly, by some descriptions, a 50% clinical depression in all medical residents. And the question is why?
Yeah.
Now, one could ask, well, maybe it's because Harvard and Stanford and Penn haven't given them the right class or haven't sent them the right paper. What we're suggesting is it's not an academic problem. It's a problem of existentialism. It's a problem of identity and emotion and coping. And that doesn't come from academic learning. That comes from being part of a really tight-knit community that can help you make meaning of experiences that are not going to be normal for most humans.
Yeah. Yeah. And what does that mean? What does that mean for education? This problem you described, what does it mean for education?
I think we're seeing, all my degrees are in education, and my wife is a teacher, and we spend a lot of time thinking about education. And what's interesting is we're having this conversation post-COVID and in the rising tide of AI and post-internet. So we're in this really interesting question of what do we mean by education?
Yeah.
Education used to be a transmission of information. It was a memorization process. You'd go to school and you'd memorize from your elders what they learned. Well, we don't need to do that anymore. We have the internet for that. So what do we mean by education? And what I'm arguing and my colleagues are arguing is education is not just about the retention of information. It's also about how to develop the skills necessary to navigate a very complicated world in all of its many modalities. This includes the world you and I are talking about, which is different, what we call the extraordinary world, which is the world of life and death. That requires an extra level of engagement by mentors and elders to help people understand, oh, you were in surgery and you didn't save the life of the 6-year-old boy. Now you have to go tell their parents they're not coming home. There is no class for that. And there couldn't be. There couldn't be a class. Here's the PowerPoint on how to do that. That's ridiculous. What you need is an old attending physician to pull you aside and say, I know that this part you probably thought you understood, but now you're starting to understand in a way that we can never describe it. And now that you're here, let's work together for you to make meaning of it so it doesn't destroy you. That's the future of education in this world. But it's going to require a fundamental re-engagement with how we're doing this.
Yeah.
In addition, what I would argue, and people lose their minds when I say this, so be prepared. Um, is that we're seeing, at least in the US, and we're seeing the coming collapse of the current medical system. It cannot survive. No one I'm talking to says it will. And I think but it's not going to go away. It'll get reborn because it has to. We still have sick people. And so what will it look like? And what I think it will look like is I think we're going to be moving to our team-based development process, which is you're going to be learning medicine and you're going to be learning how to work on teams. And I think you're going to be doing it congruently because you have to.
Yeah. And if we zoom out a little bit and take education as a whole, eh? So not only for emergency medicine, police, but in general, what are the goals of education? For example, I work with a Dutch philosopher. His name is Gert Bista. He published great books, and he talks about the three domains of education called competence, socialization, and the third one is a very interesting one. He calls it subjectivation, which is something like it's a little bit like the learner can become a critical learner and can also say no to the content and to the.
Yeah.
So it's kind of emancipation, how to call it?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. So, and in your view, in education, what is the general goal of education in this field? Is that just prepare them for the current world, for the new world, or is it just let them critical thinking about, is this a good world? You know what I mean?
Yeah, I do.
Yeah.
So there's this, I apologize, I've forgotten the person's name, but I recently listened to a talk by a researcher looking at how education in the United States is changing. And you might know these terms, they were new to me. And he talked about colonialism, relativism, and universalism. Is this a concept? Are you familiar with this in the Netherlands?
Yes, I am, but
Okay.
yeah, just.
So in the US, in the 1700s, we built colleges so that we could develop the sons of landed gentry and make them so that they could be future statesmen and leaders in the US. And at the end of World War II, we had what's called the GI Bill. And suddenly people from every stripe and color and religion and background could suddenly afford to go to college because of the GI Bill. And so you had people who were African American, you had people who were women, Hispanic, everyone was going to college, but the documents they were reading weren't written for them, didn't reflect their lived experience. In fact, some cases were just outright wrong. And so since about 1940s to about 2020, there's been this concept of relativism, which is every voice needs to be heard, right? We need to include every voice,
Yeah.
and women and men and minorities and everyone. And then Gaza happened. And what's super fascinating about this is because you have to come to the question, whereas if somebody in the 1980s, 90s, or 2000 did harm in some way, there was a liberal professor and say, well, let's dig into why. What's the context here? But what Israel and Gaza did said, no, the indiscriminate killing of children is wrong, period. Doesn't matter the context. Doesn't matter if you're Palestinian or is Israel. And I realize this is very like uh, uh, controversial what I'm saying, but I'm not actually picking a side here. What I'm saying is that as educators, we're now coming back to this idea that there are moral absolutes, and that, to your point, the student will have to determine for themselves, regardless of whose voice is being heard, what are their own moral absolutes. Do they believe that rape is wrong, that child abduction is wrong, that the killing of children is wrong? Do they believe in these things or not? Right. And then if they do believe they're wrong, then it doesn't matter who's doing it, it's wrong.
Yeah.
And I think what's happening, to your point, is we're now asking students in a way we haven't for a long time to come to their own understanding of their own belief system and how that will be manifested in their own lives and how that will drive their choices. And whether they use a religious framework or a moral framework or intellectual framework, whatever it is, they will be judged by their decisions, and they have to be at peace with their decisions, but they have to know what decisions they're making and why.
Yeah.
And so I think it's a really exciting time to be in education, because I think we have a new generation that's quite honestly saying, I get that you have historically have been oppressed, or historically have had problems, or historically have been in power. However, what you're doing right now is wrong.
Yeah, and I think especially I feel it in police education because, for example, in Holland, but I know also in the USA, I think the police as a how do you call it? As an institution has got some bad press in Holland, and it's not naturally anymore that they are respected, for example, and that what they're doing is good. So what does that mean? What does that mean for education? Because we can learn that we can learn them to be competent in the tactics and
Yep.
in procedures and so on. Okay, but what do we want them to do with it?
Yeah.
And what happens when your own moral compass is not aligned with like what you have to do? And that kind of questions.
I think I can't speak for your context, but I can say in the US that I work with a lot of law enforcement. And what I will say is this: in the 1980s, when our presidents decided to, or 60s, I should say, create a war on drugs, right?
Mhm.
Suddenly we've got police who are now involved in policing moral choices or emotional choices or domestic choices, but not being trained for them. So you take a group of people who are trained to protect society from its worst elements, now having to arbitrate or mediate between domestic disputes or drug addiction or any kind of addiction without the training to do that. And they are being put in situations they're not trained for, that they have no ability to influence a positive outcome. And they're doing it day after day after day without a lot of hope for resolution.
Yeah.
And then when they have their bad day, everyone's like, oh, the police, they suck. And I'm like, well, that was a bit of a setup, wasn't it? Like, we really set them up for that.
Yeah.
And we need to actually take more responsibility for engaging police back into the communities. They need to come from the communities. That's where they emerge from. If we remember back when the concept of policing was created by Napoleon, and it was creating the French precincts were created because prior to that, police were owned by the gentry. They were private security forces to enforce their own wealth standards. And Napoleon said, no, police should work for the people. We've lost that. Police are now working in a defensive, or in some cases offensive, capability, and they're increasingly armed against what they see as a very hostile populace. That doesn't end well unless we re-engage with everybody, because we desperately need police, but we need them as allies, not as adversaries.
Yeah. Well, thank you for this great historical explanation. I didn't know that. This I will invest it. This is great. Uh, Preston, I would like to imagine, if you like, if you want, I would like to, if you want, if you are going to write the book about mission critical teams,
Yeah.
then the biography we have already talked about. Who would you like to write a foreword? If
Oh,
if you imagine yourself writing a book about mission critical teams, who would you like to write the foreword for your book?
well, it's interesting because the great Daniel Kahneman, who won the
Yeah.
Nobel, just passed away. And he was I only met him once, but he sat down and talked to me, and he was incredibly kind and generous with his time. And just out of pure respect, I would say him,
Mm.
because there's a lot that I wish I could talk to him again, because there are nuances in his research that he never really dug into, because you can't do everything, that I would love to have gotten his insights on. I would also say General Stanley McChrystal, who I helped with his book Team of Teams. I think now that he is got some distance between him and the military, I think it would be super interesting. And there are others, but those are the two that come to
Those to
mind.
come to mind. And if we go on this track, if the book has, for example, had 5 chapters
Yeah.
about the pillars of mission critical teams, what would the chapters be like?
Oh, one would be on selection and assessment. One would be on the difference between training and education. So training is for certainty, education is for uncertainty. Um, One would be on transitions, the existential change in identity as you move through these chosen professions. One would probably be on the hero's journey, and just this idea that when you choose this profession, you're choosing what we call the hard path, and you need to take responsibility for all of that. And I guess the last one, if that's five, I'm not keeping count, but
Keeping
is
count here.
probably on after action reviews. And so this idea of
Yeah,
how do we go about making meaning of all these experiences?
great. I just saw also this paper.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
Okay.
yeah. I
If
was
it,
pretty proud of that paper.
yeah. Well, let's just talk. Let's just pick one of the two of the chapters you mentioned. This is a better approach to after action reviews. Can you? Yeah, I think my audience already knows what an after action review is, but can you just give a short summary about what it is and
Yep.
what the improvements are and why it's important?
Sure. If you're in this world and you're listening, you've probably done a billion after action reviews, or hot washes or debriefing or whatever you call it. And you've all been part of ones that are good and part of ones that are not good. And if you've done them for a while, they can often become very checklist like. We just want to get through it. It becomes very routine. We did some research with our colleagues in the Federal Bureau of Investigations, their SWAT teams. And one of my co-authors is Matt Hoffman, who is a SWAT team leader for the Federal Bureau of Investigation. And what we found was, along with our other partner, Angus Fletcher, who wrote the book Wonderworks, and is a professor at Ohio State on the idea of narrative or storytelling. And what we found is that for institutional learning to happen, meaning that the participants in an after action review will leave there and actually change their behavior on Monday, that what matters the most is that you influence the narrative that's in their head. In other words, what story will they tell about this event on Monday? Will it be, I'm terrible, you're terrible, we're terrible? Or is it, wow, we went through this, we've got some work to do, but we're making progress. And here's what I need to do next. That story matters actually way more than whatever conclusions you as a leader have come up with. That's how I'd sum it up.
That okay. And in the paper you mention three improvements.
Yeah.
And the first one is influence a community, not a process. What does it mean?
It means that don't get stuck on the checklist. Don't get stuck on the data. That will be a result of the narrative. You really want to focus on the process and engage with every voice needs to be heard. Otherwise, you're not getting all the data.
Okay. And then the second one is spend 75% of your time on part two. What does that mean?
Well, in a traditional after action review, the review is three parts. What
Yeah.
was the plan? What actually happened? And what's the delta? What's different do we need to make? That second part, what actually happened? You really need to take time and get everybody to tell the story of what actually happened from their perspective, with everyone's voice being heard. Only then can you understand what really happened.
And it reminds me of there is in Europe there is the EUSIM. It's the European simulation course. They use the Steinwach method of debriefing. It's a debriefing method for simulation training.
Yep.
And they also use this describe phase where every participant describes how you call it, chronologisch, the time.
Complain.
No, time in a time frame what happened.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah. Okay, so that's important that everybody describes. And then three is tell the whole story. What does that mean?
So what ends up happening we've all been in the staff lounge or the pub after an event. And the stories that get told are the stories that are funny, or the stories that make you look like a hero or make somebody else look like a hero. Well, the stories that don't get told are the ones that leave you a little shaken, the ones that make you a little nauseous, the ones that, like, if I was a second slower, this all would have ended poorly, or I went left when I should have gotten right and I fixed it, but I hope no one saw it. Those are the stories that have to get told. The really ones that make you cringe.
So and this research, a better approach to after action reviews. Is it also implemented somewhere in
It's
teams?
implemented in a lot of places. A lot of teams are now doing it. It's not to be done every day. It's a lengthy process.
Yeah.
But for line of duty desks or something important, doing what's called a narrative review or just getting everybody to tell their story really matters.
And you also mentioned in other podcasts about storytelling, and also
Yes.
Dan Dworkis talked about it. I
Yep.
remember. What is storytelling, and what does it mean in mission critical teams culture?
So we have a director of story named Claire Murphy. She's a traditional Irish storyteller. And the reason we originally did it was because when we were getting new operators to become instructors, one of the things we were facing is they had a lot of insecurities about their ability to do the job. And instead of admitting to it, all they would do was just make the training harder because they knew how to do that. But that was often ineffective and actually counterproductive. When we started to take their natural ability, because every mission critical team is really good at storytelling, it's part of their culture, and we take that existing ability, that native ability, and we deconstruct it, and then we reconstruct it for the purpose of teaching. Suddenly we take something, a skill somebody already has, and we accelerate it, and suddenly they're like, oh, I can do this. And then we can teach other things. We can teach Socratic listening and dialogic, interactions, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
And can you give an example of a concrete story? What kind of stories do we have to think of in, for example, special forces, Green Berets, whatever, NASA? What are some of the stories? How do they?
Yeah, so they're all very, very specific, and there are different kinds of stories. So one is a story if you're working in the Dutch police. There's a story of a thing that happened a few years ago that people still talk about. And they talk about it because it changed something.
Mm.
And they need to tell that story to new people so they understand the context, but they also need to understand the culture. We're like this because of this event, and this is what changed everything. That's one kind of story. There's also teaching stories. There's stories where you can't, people will often not remember data, meaning directions to the supermarket that is hard to remember. But I can tell you a story and you'll remember it forever. And so that's when you embed knowledge into stories, they will hold on to it longer.
Yeah. Do you also use it yourself if you're teaching
Yeah,
stories?
I use storytelling all the time. And
Yeah.
I use it for a variety of different reasons. Sometimes it's to embed theory into something like teaching situational awareness, tell a story so it helps people remember the components of it, or uh if I need to do an intervention with somebody because they're locked in their own head because they're not resetting after an evolution, I'll tell them a story to distract them and then help them sort of think about the world a different way, a kind of perspective taking. These are things that instructors naturally do all the time. They just don't always label it.
Yeah, I can also imagine that, for example, I work with teams who, their stories became a little bit toxic, so to speak.
Oh yeah,
Um, and that's very difficult because if you're in that environment and you're new and you recognize the toxicity of the story,
yeah,
yeah, is it recognizable for you? Or do you recognize this?
yeah, yeah. And our strategy for that is that we name it. So
Hmm.
when they tell me a toxic story, I'll just say, hey, that's a pretty heavy story. Why did you tell me that?
Hmm.
Like, what was the reason for telling that story? I want to know. And if it's them saying, well, you need to understand what you're getting into, meaning you need to understand how much it sucks here. And I was like, whoa, like we have choices here, right? And that's history, and I'm not a victim of history, right? I get
Yeah,
a voice too.
yeah. Is storytelling the narrative? Is it closely connected to identity?
Yeah, it is. Both identity of individual and identity of team. So the story the team tells about themselves is their identity.
There is I think in Holland, there has been traditionally, for example, SWAT teams had a kind of culture,
Yeah,
and they felt they had a strong identity. And then there came some time where we thought that it's better to be just like the other cops
yeah,
and to de-romanticize it. I
yeah,
think it also happened in the military. But I have always felt, because as a young boy, I lived on the streets and I had some tribes, so to speak. And when I got in martial arts, there was a tribe.
yeah.
I found it as a young man very interesting and appealing, and it helped me a lot in my identity. You know,
Yeah,
like
I agree.
but yeah, but how strong should a culture or identity be?
Well, in what we're talking about is that for people to sustain themselves in this on the hard path, what we call the
Yeah.
hard path, they need three things. They need connection, belonging, and becoming.
Mhm.
They need to feel connected to someone. They need to belong to the group, and they need to feel like they're learning something, becoming. Now, belonging really matters because that tribe piece. The truth is that a SWAT person who has a bad day, only somebody else on the SWAT team will understand. And as well intentioned as an outside psychologist or leader or chaplain or social worker, as well intentioned as they won't understand because they did not smell the blood. They did not hear the screaming, and they can't. And if they never have, they won't truly understand. They'll say nice words and they'll be good intentioned, but they won't understand. And sometimes people who've chosen the hard path, what they need more than anything else when they're in their darkness is for one other person to understand what they experienced.
Yeah. It looks now you talk about it, connection, belonging, and becoming. It looks a lot like the self-determination theory.
Yeah,
With these are nice. These are maybe better words than competence, autonomy, and this great.
yeah. Well, yeah, this comes from the Reverend Sue Phillips, Dr. Reverend Sue Phillips at the Sacred Design Labs. She does a lot of work at looking at identity and how to find a sense of self and worth in your work, and
Ah,
that's where that comes from.
great. You also talked in one of the chapters would be about transitions. What do you mean by that? To give some context, I'm not sure if we're talking about the same, but I'm now 54, and I feel different than I was 10 years ago.
Yeah,
And also not only physical, but also, the perspective on life and how
of
to,
course.
of course. But I feel that there is not so much attention for this because as officers we are treated equally for every age,
Yeah.
and as doctors also I think. But what are transitions, and are we talking about the same?
Yeah, we
Yeah,
are. So in the traditional tribes, and then there used to be rites of passage.
yeah.
You would move from childhood to as a man, childhood to manhood, and then from manhood you would be an apprentice or journeyman, and then you would become a master. And there would be these, and they would be celebrated each of these transitions. And we don't have those now. And I think at least on the hard path, it really matters because when you are new onto a team, you need to feel as though you're accepted. When you go from being a peer to a leader for the first time, and it's very isolating, that transition needs to be acknowledged. When you get a little older and you can no longer work out the same way you did at 20, you need to have a transition for that. And you need to have multiple of these in your life so that the final transition when you retire isn't catastrophic. And so we're arguing that we need a transition curriculum inside of these
Hmm.
teams.
Are you aware of the work of Chip Conley with the Elderly Wisdom Academy?
No.
Yeah, it's really fascinating. Chip Conley, he wrote a lot of books. Also, Wisdom at Work was a great book about multi-generational workplaces.
Yeah.
But also his Elderly Academy, because it's about transitioning from midlife to, like
Yeah.
not to the last part of life, but
Yeah.
between yeah, and also is the same. How do we find rituals for that, and how do we find rites of
Yes.
passage?
Agreed.
And
I agree
you
with that.
do you have a curriculum already developed for that?
We are working with one of our teams to develop such a curriculum, and we're
Ah,
hoping in the next year or two to test it and release it.
that would be great, I think. In emergency medicine, as of course you know this as much as I know, but there's also in Holland we speak about the new generation of doctors
Yeah.
who have a different view of their work and society, and
Yeah.
these are also transitions. And
They are, and I would like to defend them. And the reason is because if we're honest, the new generation has come into police and emergency medicine and all these other things. And someone said, "Hey, do you want to become a doctor?" And they look at their role models who are 40 and 50, who are who statistically have a higher chance of alcoholism and drug abuse and depression and divorce and alienation from their children and eventually suicide. And they say, you know what, I would like to be a doctor, but I don't want any of that. So I'm going to actually engage with this differently. And then all the people that are formally broken are like, oh, you're soft. No, they just actually want to know their children their whole lives.
yeah,
And I don't think that's a terrible thing.
yeah, yeah. I think so. Yeah. Hey, if we go back to the book and you wrote the first 5 chapters about the pillars of mission critical teams. If you had to write chapters on education, say for example 3 chapters on the education of mission critical teams
Yeah.
operators,
Yep.
what would the topics of the chapters be like?
On education,
Yeah.
they'd be training, education, and professional development. So it would be training for certainty, like the stuff we all know, how to do good habits. Education would be about how do you get into a dialogic relationship with somebody to basically surface their principles, their heuristics, all those things. And then professional development is about identity. Who are you as you transition through these roles?
Hmm.
What are your moral absolutes? What are your belief systems? All that.
You talk about the difference between training and education a lot. Can you just unpack it a little bit more? What is
Sure.
the difference?
If you're doing, for our listeners, if you're doing a trauma resuscitation and you get a resident who's showing up, when we wrote a paper called the DR5, and
Yeah.
it stands for detection, recognition, reaction, response, reset, and reflection. And basically, what that means is, as they approach the patient, are they detecting what the primary threat is? Are they oriented towards it? And then are they recognizing what the actual problem is? And then are they properly reacting? And once they've reacted, are they stepping back to respond to the larger like trend of events, right? And then once the event is over, and they might be in that cycle for a little bit, but once that event is over, are they emotionally resetting, even if they made mistakes, to go to the next patient? And then reflection is, are they learning each day? So we wrote this paper, it's available online, it's at the end of our website. And so reaction is about training. It's about wrists and fingers and elbows and shoulders and hips. It's about movement and body language and habits. We know how to do that. We're very good at it. We've been doing it for a long, long time. Response is different. Response is reflect. By the way, training is for certainty, meaning the answer is always going to be 4. The answer is always going to be 18 inches over here. That's training. You know the answer and it won't change. Or if it
Yeah.
changes, you know the new answer.
Yeah.
Response is about education. That means that everything depends. Well, it depends. If the person's doing this, we have to do this. But if they're doing this and this, we got to do this. In order for you to influence that, you can't tell people. You have to ask people. So you have to be in an inquiry relationship.
Hmm.
And then professional development is, do you see yourself as a member of this team? Do you see yourself as a leader? Do you see yourself as having views of right and wrong? Do you see yourselves making a choice and all these other things, right? So
Yeah.
that's how I think about those things.
So that would be 3 chapters at least.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Um, I have recently studied a little bit about adaptive versus routine expertise.
Yep.
Um, and we have a lot of discussion about it, especially in medicine, because traditionally they first start with the routines, with the techniques, with the route memorization, and so on and so on, and then later on make some variations. But the really hardcore adaptive expertise guys and girls, they start different with presenting problems, for example.
Yeah.
What is your view about adaptive expertise, or what does it mean, or is it part of your curriculum, your thoughts?
Yeah, I So there's a bunch of ways to answer or engage with that question. And here's what I would say. If you talk to great jazz players, they're usually classically trained in music, meaning they know how to use their instrument. Then they can adapt off of that. So it's very boring for this generation to do repetitive training. And they're like, this is dumb. The problem is you need to do it enough where you stop thinking about it. And only then can you do adaptive engagement. And so I think it's a mistake to go too quickly to adaptive sort of behavior if you like too quickly to the shortcuts if you don't know the traditional way. Now, that said, it is reasonable and I think expected that people know why they're doing the thing you're asking them to do. And that's where the adaptive dialogue, which is to say, the reason you have to get this routine behavior down is because it can present this way or this way or this way or this way. But I need you to know what the first 30 seconds look like, or the first, I need you to have press play, press go on your brain. And I need you to automate the first 30 or 60 seconds so the rest of your brain can be problem solving. But in order for that to happen, you got to have those memories, those habits baked in.
Yeah, so in police training, I'm not sure if you follow it, but today there's a lot of talk about the constraint-led approach, ecological dynamics approach, where, well, it's more about presenting problems and becoming problem solvers. There are even titles of articles called fundamentals are not needed and so on. So there is a little bit discussion about how to approach, for example, skill training, and I've always felt that some basics
Yeah.
are needed, especially if you are, maybe if you're doing mixed martial arts, it's different. But if you are, for example, with firearms instruction, you cannot just, there are some basics for safety at least. Eh?
I don't know enough about the literature on fundamentals are not necessary, but on its face, I would disagree with it.
Yeah,
On its face. And it has to do more with not rote performance, but the building of confidence through competence.
yeah.
I need my people to be confident in their physical behavior in order for us to have these adaptive conversations. In the absence of that, I think it's too messy.
Yeah. Preston, if Patrick Schouwberg, you met him in
Yeah,
London, and
yeah,
Patrick would love to become one day the director of well-being.
yeah.
It's not a how do you call it? It's not a function already, but maybe he can make it. But if you were the director of well-being for mission critical teams, what kind of concrete interventions would you make for the teams to stay healthy and vital and sharp and like
There's
what?
there's a million of them, but I guess I'll start here. One of the things that we're having to come to terms with right now is the fact that and I've been part of many selection processes for a lot of teams around the world, some of the most elite teams in the world. And what we're looking for are people that believe in service to something greater than themselves, this idea of sacrifice on behalf of others, and this idea of hard work. And we select for that. And I believe in that. Here's the problem. Post-information age, you're getting more emails, texts, videos, communications than you can do in one day. So we've now entered into a post-information age where there's more data and information than you can consume with an historical framework of sacrifice, hard work, and commitment to others. So it's set us up for self-destruction. So we are now twisting and warping the concept of sacrifice and hard work to destroy people.
Hmm.
And so what I would say first and foremost is we have to now treat information the same way we treat unlimited access to food, drugs, um, and alcohol. More is not good for you, and more of the wrong kind is not good for you. And so we're going to have to get everyone to be more honest about what they mean about hard work, what they mean about doing their job, what they mean about sacrifice, and to do so in the concept of role modeling. Not what are you prepared to do, but what are you willing to pass on to your subordinates? Because if you work at 6 a.m. to, 8 p.m. every day, um, trying to keep up, one, you're going to fail. It won't
Yeah.
work. And two, you're going to burn everyone out and yourself and destroy them. We're going to have to rethink all of this.
So this is not an easy fix. This is about
This is a generational problem.
generational problem.
Yeah.
And how do you tackle this in your own personal life? Because I can imagine you're a very passionate man, and you have your institute and the things you
Yeah.
deeply love. And for example, I have experienced. That's why I didn't came to London, because
Yeah.
I did it too many times the last 30 years, and I
Yeah.
became a little bit tired, so to speak.
Yeah. Well, it's just
So
that. It's getting better at saying no.
yeah,
So it's about asking hard questions like, will this choice that I'm about to make move me closer to what I'm trying to accomplish? And if the answer is no, then the answer is no.
yeah.
It can't just be because, oh, I'm flattered, or oh, that's interesting, or oh, I like those people. Unfortunately, we have to be very disciplined about our time now in a way that we
Yeah.
haven't before.
What are current projects you are fired up by, or problems?
I am things like the apprenticeship model that we're working on, trying to understand apprenticeship. I am deeply interested in trying to understand the rate of learning problem, which is how fast can humans effectively learn in dynamic settings.
Mm.
I'm very interested in um, stress inoculation, what that really means in a modern case. What stressors are we talking about? Those are the kinds of things I'm super fascinated in right now.
Okay. And are you, with regard to performance under pressure, what is your, because I've a lot of discussions with colleagues about this, and I have the impression that chronic stress is maybe more important than the acute stress. This
Oh
is
yeah,
just
yeah, yeah,
intuition, and but we are still hammering down all those performance psychology, how you call it,
yeah.
interventions. But I'm not sure if you can prevent this, what you mentioned yet, eh? With
Well, let me ask you an odd question. Let me ask you a
yeah,
question.
yeah,
So you grew up in Holland,
yeah.
is that right? Yeah. What's your relationship with water, with the ocean?
Um, well, I was from a generation, we had no problems, but my generation before that, they had a lot of problems with water. We are
Yeah,
living below sea level, of course, and
yeah.
that can be a scary thing. Yeah.
But are you scared all the time?
No.
But it's a threat, right?
Yeah.
So what's interesting is if you go sort of metaphysical and you say that the ocean is a type of wilderness, and for your country in specific, you have to have a relationship with wilderness. You can't be immune to it. You can't ignore it. You can't, it's there. It's there all the time. And so your countrymen either have to come to peace with it so they can live their lives, or they'll be destroyed by it. And I would say you guys are uniquely situated to understand how to have a relationship with a enduring stress, with
Mm.
something that's chronic, something that's there all the time. And yet culturally you found a way to both structurally and emotionally and spiritually and culturally find a detente, if you might, if you right.
Yeah.
And what will happen, because the changing weather is, it'll be generational. So the generation before you was very scary. And then they built a lot of things and got better. But I have a feeling that in the next generation or your generation, there'll probably be a resurgence where as sea levels rise, you're going to have to rethink the problem. And so
Yeah.
there'll be a period of scary as well. But you're not going to give up. It's not, you clearly have demonstrated, yeah, we'll
Yeah.
just figure it out. And I think I'm using that as example because I think it's a great example to say, information is now has to be like your relationship with the ocean. It's
Mm.
big, it's there, it's a wilderness, it's bigger than us, has more power than we do, and yet we can still live our lives. I don't know if that metaphor works, but that's how I think
Yeah.
about
And do you feel that we are on a tip? Do you feel that we are right now on a, yeah, how do you call it? On a transition point with regard to, as a father, for example, I'm not sure if I'm happy with where the world is going for my
it. Yeah.
children, and it feels a little bit with the AI coming. I'm not sure. It's well, you talk about uncertainty.
Well, so you know this concept of liminality, right? Where between two generations, there's this uncertainty of what will happen. And if we go back through history, right, the uncertainty on Holland before, in the 1930s must have been catastrophic, right? With the changing war and you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Or even World War One or the Spanish influenza or et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Every couple of generations, we face an existential crisis. And every generation, we find a group of people that get us out of it. And because I work with most extraordinary people in the world, I'm like, yeah, change is coming. It's always come. Winter's coming too. And then there'll be spring. Like it won't kill us. It'll be some bad days for sure, but then we'll figure it out.
Mm.
Like we just always have. I'm meeting the people that are working on these problems and I'm super optimistic. Will it be bad? Sure it will, but we've chosen the hard path. We expect it to be bad.
What are the greatest challenges for mission critical teams operators in this age in the
In this age, the biggest challenge is they're transitioning from teamwork to teaming. Amy Edmondson's work. And so the days of you working on a team with all of your friends and knowing how to finish each other's sentences, that's starting to change. You're
Mm,
now having to work on a lot of cross-functional teams, a lot of what we call tactical swarms.
mm.
So knowing how to maintain your identity, knowing how to maintain your tribe and your purpose and your role in an ever-shifting context is very hard.
Where can people learn that kind of thing in working in tactical
Well,
swarm
we're
teams?
we're developing curriculum right now to work with our teams, but I think it has to happen locally with your community. Like again, you have to name it. You have to say, "Hey, folks, is anyone else feeling this?" And then if when they say yes, can we just chat about that for a moment and be intentional? I think that matters.
Yeah. To end a little bit, because I want to be careful of your time, what are some favorite books of yours? And I just recently saw this again. I know that you were in wilderness
Oh yeah,
education. Do you
yeah,
know?
that was a long time ago. That was a former
Yeah.
life of mine. Yeah,
Oh
I
yeah.
haven't seen that book in a while. I think I have it on my
Yeah.
shelf somewhere.
Yeah. It's.
Um,
I found it a great book.
Yeah, it's a really good book,
Yeah.
and the authors are amazing.
Wow.
So I'm a big believer in adventure, experiential education, or expeditionary education. I think it's super important. Um, my books, the problem with me, it's like asking what my favorite song is or my favorite bottle of wine is. I'm like, well, what's the context, right?
Yeah.
So, um,
Okay,
I
just one for general inspiration and one for for mission critical teams, whatever, for work.
it's interesting. Um, So I would say Team of Teams by General McChrystal. I'm biased because I helped write it or helped contribute to it. I didn't help write it, help contribute to it, excuse me. Um, and then I would say, and this is a weird one, but there's an author named Somerset Maugham, Maugham, who wrote in the 1930s and during World War One. And he wrote a book called The Razor's Edge.
Hmm.
And it's also been made into a movie, a couple of movies, but it's this book about this guy prior to World War One who's living a normal life, and then he becomes an ambulance driver in France in World War One, and he comes home a different person, and he spends the rest of his life traveling the world, the 1930s, trying to understand the world he's now engaged in, and I think it holds up really well, even these next generations, and it was a book that I think about a lot,
Wow.
and so yeah,
Do you like reading, Preston?
I do. I like a lot.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Also, besides work, besides or no?
Yes,
Yeah.
I listen to audiobooks a lot because I do
Mhm.
woodworking. I listen to a lot of science fiction. I'm fascinated by science fiction.
Wow.
And then obviously workbooks, right? There's a bunch of books like for example, what did I just finish? Hold on. I go through them pretty aggressively. And so um where's the book that I'm trying to find for you? Where is it? Um, it's called, oh, it's not showing up, but it was about AI and it's
Mm.
about, um, God, I don't know why it's not, oh, here we go. Hold on. I've got the wrong thing processed. Here we go. The Age of Spiritual Machines by Ray Kurzweil, who's a
Mm.
futurist. And
Ah,
it's about 3 hours long, but it's about um, his views on the coming AI. I found it okay. I don't know if it was, you know, all that, but it was interesting to do, to read. Um, yeah, I'm
is
just looking through.
is it important, do you think, for our generation to invest some learning into AI to understand it a little bit more? Or will it?
I don't know if we know enough yet um,
Mm.
to do it, but yes, I think we should pay attention to it for sure because it will be part of our lives,
Yeah.
and it will be making decisions on our behalf, which whether we like it or not, probably still is already is. And so I'm paying attention to it. I just don't know yet. In the same way, I didn't know how. I'm old enough to was here before computers, right? I got my first computer in the seventh grade and that changed everything. And then the internet changed everything. And then the cell phone changed everything. AI is going to be like that. And every one of those, they told me my life would change, work would get easier. We'd all have vacations all the time, every single time. And none of that happened. Work got harder. Like more things started happening, more options became available. I think the same will happen with AI. I
Yeah.
tend to think that history is a trend.
That's a great one. Physical activity, is it also important for you?
Yeah, we own a sailboat. We own a 36-foot sailboat in the Chesapeake Bay. And so we try to sail. I try to get out road biking, but lately that's not been really good. I got to get after it. And then I do woodworking. And so it's very important to move because I like walking. And so my body's all broken. And if I don't keep moving, it'll stop
Ah,
moving.
this reminds me of you talking about the third thing, isn't
Yes.
it? About
Yeah.
doing something.
Outside of work, outside of family.
Yeah,
It's
yeah,
really important that everyone finds something each year to be a beginner at. Really
yeah.
important.
Well, can I put two articles in the show notes, like the after action review? Is
Of
that?
course.
And I found also another article of yours. It's called a novel framework for routine versus critical communication in the
Yep.
Journal of Orthopedic
Yep.
Surgery.
Yep.
And it's a beautiful concept, routine versus critical comms. Did I forget some question, Preston?
Nope.
Did you want to tell something else?
No, I think it's been wide ranging and yeah, I think it's really good.
Well, that's great. Well, thank you so much. And if operators or trainers are interested, they can they contact you directly, or what is
They
the best
certainly
way?
they certainly can. They can reach out on our website. My email is there. Reach out to us. Um, and yeah, my colleague Dan Dorcas is, I believe, coming to the Netherlands to
Yeah.
speak. And so he'll be there soon. And so he's a director, he's our chief medical officer and director of medicine. So he's actually a better person than I am to speak about medical stuff. And so I would say keep an eye out for his arrival. And I'm sure he'd be willing to talk to anybody.
Well, thank you so much for your time, and for the listeners also. I think you can learn a lot about Preston and his Mission Critical Team Institute. So thank you, Preston, and I will put the end button